And our focus is on something, well, let me just share this first, is on, it isn't on research itself, except it is on teaching experiences that actually end up being very conceptually related. So, and this was the topic that David invited us to talk about. So let me start with a pre-question. As soon as I could get my, excuse me. So this is a pre-question that we're asking you to ponder before we start. Could you think about something that took place in a class you were teaching that was particularly meaningful for you for any reason? How did you feel when the meaningful event occurred? And maybe write yourself a couple notes. So I didn't do this on purpose, but yesterday I actually had an experience that was not in a classroom, but I suddenly realized as I was thinking about this presentation last night was actually very directly relevant to it. So I'm just going to share the experience I had yesterday that might spark you thinking of your own. Yesterday, the accreditors for the Association to Advance Collegiate Schools of Business were at our university. And I learned that one of the deans who was there was somebody I had met last year. And I had gotten a hat of his university. So having learned this, I went off to meet him when he was coming out of a session, only to learn that the session he was coming out of was a lunch with many of the full professors in my school. And I hadn't been invited to the lunch. I suddenly saw all these full professors coming out of the room. And at first I thought, did I screw up? Was I supposed to be there? No, it turned out I wasn't. I hadn't been invited. And so I felt, and then when I said hi, he didn't remember me, and I felt silly wearing a hat. So this was actually a very meaningful event for me yesterday. Made me feel really upset. Made me feel like, gee, I don't really count here anymore. So I'm not going to spend any more time on that, but I just want to mention that when it happened yesterday, I started to think maybe it's relevant for people to hear something like this as a stimulus for their thinking. Enough of that. So here's the outline of our presentation. We're going to talk about relevance in management education. Actually, in many ways, management education deals with relevance more than any other activity that academics are involved in. We're going to be presenting 3 vignettes, a study in which I was involved, a teaching experience Isabelle had, an informal survey of meaningfulness and emotion, and then give a discussion and implications for practice, a conclusion. And I just want to mention that there will be 3 common threads: meaning, emotion, and relevance. And also, just to reinforce what David said, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to, pardon me, I will also say that I will be talking some of the time, Isabelle will be talking some of the time. If you have questions along the way, feel free to put them in the Q&A section, and Isabelle will check on those while I'm talking, and I'll check on them while Isabelle is talking, if there's something that we should discuss before the presentation is done. So here is the stereotype of education, of management education. The student is saying, hey, teach, why are we learning this complicated formula? What does this have to do with anything? And the assumption in that, the stereotype is classroom relevance means students want to know something specific. They want to know it today. They don't want it to have long, they don't want it to be conceptually deep. They want to just know something. What can I do tomorrow? And that is the stereotype of relevance, at least in the US. So you all should feel free to say if that's not the case in your settings. But from whatever perspective, whether it's stereotypical or not, relevance actually matters to management education quite a bit. One of the reasons is that business education programs actually address issues that are relevant to us. I'll say more about that in a minute. Students are likely to feel more motivated when they feel they're addressing something that matters. And they're likely to be more involved when they're addressing something that matters. So just to say, oh, they only care about something that's directly meaningful to them, yep, that could be the case, and that's all right. So this is important for many reasons. One is that business schools teach a whole lot of students in the world, probably a whole lot more than in most other disciplines. And they go on to have important managerial roles. And in addition, a lot of what we teach actually has the potential to be self-relevant. I often think of that with psychology courses, where something like that, although you're addressing all this personality stuff that matters. But it's the case with business schools too. And business schools also are very different from topics like physics or chemistry that involve understanding phenomena that are external to us. But if we talk about performance, about success, about how to manage, all kinds of things like that, those are all potentially very relevant to the students themselves. One of the things that's going on right now in the US in particular, so this is a question for you all. I assume it's the case in the UK or whatever countries you're in, but I'll just say what I know from my perspective and from Isabel's perspective. There's a whole lot of emphasis on the curriculum in management education. Hartley Porter McKibben, in a famous work, said that what universities do with students is largely a function of the curriculum. Augier and March said curricula should be relevant to students' needs, and we could give many more examples of that. With the ACSB, for example, they wanted to see what are our curricula. Right now in the US, there are really contentious political battles about curriculum, especially about what DEI, that's called here. I don't know if it's the same where you all are. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm just going to give a couple examples, but from very recent literature. The state of Florida has an education commissioner who has decided that sociology is woke ideology. The whole discipline has been hijacked by left-wing activists. So students enrolled in one of the California systems have to take 5 social science courses, no more sociology for them, because that's left-wing activist woke ideology, all of it. In the state of Alabama, several members of their legislature have pushed through a measure that would not only ban state funding for DE&I programs, but also limit the teaching of divisive concepts like race, gender, and identity. On the other hand, Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania has started a new required course on power, inequity, and justice that came about in part because of a student revolt that they weren't teaching it. So in other words, there's no question that what goes in the curriculum for a course is really important. But that's not all that happens in a classroom. You and I can all imagine ways that we could teach DEI in ways that would be deadly boring for students, as well as having opposite effects. A lot that happens that matters is what happens in the classroom. So it's also important to appreciate what are students' experiences, understandings, and emotional reactions to curriculum topics and class activities. So to address this, we're going to present 3 vignettes. One is their self-protective or self-enhancing responses to research findings, their very emotional responses to research findings, and their descriptions of what is meaningful to them in class and how meaningful it feels. Okay, so I will present the first part. This is based on a study that's published in the Academy of Management Learning and Education that I was involved in with Dan Kaprar, Boram Doe, and Sarah Rines. What we did in that paper was explore why undergraduate students enrolled in management classes did or did not accept some specific management research arguments. So Professor Frank Schmidt from Iowa had done a great deal of research that said that the primary predictor of people's success at work is how intelligent they are. This was a G score. This was very important, so what he was saying was basically the most important predictor of student success at work is how literally smart they are, based in part on IQ scores and based on grade point average. And we compared their response to how much they agreed with that to how much they would think that the primary importance for success is emotional intelligence or fit with a job. I know that this is a complete newsflash to you all, that how much students accepted the argument about the importance of intelligence was positively related to their grade point average. Now, again, a huge surprise, those with higher grade point averages said, yes, absolutely, intelligence is what matters more than anything else. In addition, there was something else going on here that was important. The relationship between grade point average and acceptance of the argument for the importance of intelligence was moderated by emotional stability. So here is the basic argument. The higher the grade point average, the greater the acceptance of the argument for the importance of intelligence. But there was a moderator, which was called emotional stability. I don't know how many of you have taken the personality measures of the big 5 personality characteristics, but one of them is emotional stability at one end and neuroticism at the other end. And what was found in the study was there was a stronger relationship between grade point average and acceptance of the argument for students who were pretty neurotic. So when I went back and looked at this, my grades in college, especially the first 2 years, were not very good. So when I took the Big 5 personality inventory, I was in the something like 85th percentile on neuroticism. So I would have really I would have been one of the people who would have really flipped out seeing this argument. I would have saw myself as basically a failure already. And there was also something else that was important that was going on, was that students' reasons for accepting or rejecting the argument, when we asked them, why do you think this, tended to be either self-protective or self-enhancing. I'm not sure how familiar you are with this theoretical argument, but the basic notion is that when we see something positive about ourselves, we see this as self-enhancing. Well, gee, I'm really good. This makes me feel really good about myself. Or if we see something really negative about ourselves, we get super self-protective. We need to protect ourselves from something that is going on emotionally. So this is actually a fairly sophisticated conceptual argument for what's happening in class. So when you think about it in your class and your teaching, when are your students feeling good about themselves? When are they feeling that they need to protect themselves? So here's an example of someone with a higher GPA. Where I work, I had to take a test, which I scored well on. I've been there for 2 years and have made a lot of improvements in myself and the company. For lower GPAs, well, I don't have the highest GPA in the world, but I'm a very hard worker and strive to get my work done all the time. So this is, I don't know if you reflect on curriculum that you teach, but this is likely to be one of the things that's going on among your students. Knowing this has certainly affected the way I reflect on my own teaching. So the moral of the story, many of the topics we cover in class, like a simple HR topic, like the smarter you are, the more likely you are to be successful, are really relevant to our students' lives. And one of the things they do is affirm or challenge the student's senses of how valuable they are as people or how much they need to protect themselves in your class. So we'll now turn this over to Isabelle and a classroom experience Isabelle had.
Thank you, Jean. All right, I'd like to share with all of you this second vignette, which is an experience from my own classroom. So at Montclair State University, where I teach, I usually teach organizational behavior and leadership classes. And in these classes, I often assign short research highlights for students to read and discuss. And by research highlights, what I'm referring to are those shorter, usually 2 to 3 pages, very applicable and engaging articles that are translated from the full 40 or 30-page academic papers. So for example, the International Association of Chinese Management Research, this is a scholarly association. They have this Management Insights journal, magazine, in which they translate these practitioner-oriented insights from those full top research journals papers. And also Academy of Management, they have a magazine called Academy of Management Insights. This is a magazine that also translates from the research papers published by the Academy of Management's journals, such as Academy of Management Journal, Academy of Management Discoveries. And I use these materials in various forms. For example, I may list it as a required reading or supplementary reading. I may post them for online or classroom discussions about the readings. And sometimes I ask students to read these articles and then give a mini presentation to introduce and interpret the research findings on their own. So for a class session on diversity, I assigned several research highlights articles for students to read and discuss. So I assigned about 4 to 5 articles, but there's one article that stood out. So this article is titled 12 Challenges Faced by Employees from Poorer Families, which is an article published by the Academy of Management Insights, translated from a Academy of Management Annals paper. The article suggests that even when people have the same education and job opportunities, those from poorer families still face many disadvantages. So the article talks about a lot of disadvantages. Some of the examples are biases that they may face in selection and performance evaluations, and the lack of mentors from people who have the same background as them. So I assigned this article over several semesters, and this started back in 2020 during the pandemic. So some of the classes are fully online, asynchronous. Some of them are synchronous online, and now some of the classes are fully in person. So it's done in various formats. So I observed a diverse array of student reactions to this article. Some students said that they've never thought about these subtle but still very real and concrete challenges that people from poorer families may face. And some students, they express strong agreement with the research findings, that they say they already experienced this in their life, or they've already observed these tendencies in their organizational life, not by themselves, but maybe observing other people. What I really want to emphasize here is that it quickly became apparent to me that the article triggered some very strong emotions, much more than what I had anticipated. So some students expressed very strong disagreement with the research findings. They found some sentences from the article to be very discriminatory, arrogant, and offensive toward people from poorer families. They felt angry, upset, discouraged, and very disappointed, or even disheartened. In my discussions, a few students even elaborately told their own life stories or their family's history about how they went from having nothing to creating a very successful career or business, just to question the findings of this article. Another thing I observed is that student discussions are way more heated in person and in live Zoom sessions than in asynchronous discussion boards. And this discussion is also highly interactive. Students are not just expressing their thoughts to me, but building on each other's reactions. And sometimes they express agreement. Sometimes the emotions gets more intense because they saw someone else feeling the same way. Sometimes they help each other clarify some misunderstandings. And I, as a professor, I play the role of an observer and facilitator. I sometimes step in to clarify about how the researchers draw these conclusions and what they meant, and especially when the interpretations by the students deviated a little bit too far from what is meant by the article. So this experience triggered many questions for me about relevance. So for those who complain that scholarly research isn't relevant, does what happened in this classroom count as relevance? If it counts, then is it good relevance or bad relevance that some students misinterpret the findings and feel very, very emotional about it? And is there a right way for students to interpret the research findings? And what does it matter that this article unexpectedly trigger strong emotions from students? And going back to an earlier point, these experiences are also very consistent with those described in the prior study by Capra et al. Students' responses, disagreement or agreement, strong emotions, they're likely affected by their need to protect their self-esteem, especially if they grew up in a family background described by the article as quite disadvantaged in the workplace. Some students may not have related closely to the arguments, perhaps because they did not grow up in a family like this or did not have much experience interacting with people from that background.
And let me just add a little. Isabelle teaches at a university that has students from a variety of academic backgrounds.
Yeah,
Pardon me, a variety of personal backgrounds. Go ahead, sorry.
We have a lot of first-generation students, a lot of second immigrants. Our programs really emphasize social mobility. So I guess some of the reactions are highly tied to this mixed background.
And I think that's important. I would imagine many of you are teaching in universities that have some similar groups of students. Okay, so I am going to go on to vignette 3. I will say that what I'm going to describe here was done at Boston College, where students tend on the whole to be better off economically than students that Isabelle teaches. But at any rate, based on, in large part, on what Isabelle's experience had been, I started thinking that this kind of experience is very meaningful. So I started to think in a class, what does meaningful mean? How does it feel? So we start with the notion that what we teach is relevant to our students. Then that also means that it has meaning and significance for them. And that meaning and significance comes with feelings. As Isabelle mentioned, there was a lot of emotion expressed among her students, especially when they were talking with each other and not just responding asynchronously. So meaningfulness has been a subject of a good deal of academic study. It's something that holds significance for people. It's recognized as very consequential. And it's usually treated as positive, though it might not be. The experience I had yesterday of realizing I hadn't been to a meeting, plus a guy I thought would recognize me didn't, have a lot of significance for me. Definitely was not positive. Emotion, on the other hand, one of the things I have learned in the process of this work is people talk about meaningfulness all the time, but it doesn't include any discussion of emotion that comes with it. But clearly, the kind of events that Isabelle and I are talking about have lots of emotion. In fact, most meaningful experiences that any of us have an emotional component. If you were reflecting on something for you, I'm sure it had emotions. And literature on learning in particular, if we're going to learn something, it has to include, it is likely to include something that's meaningful and has some kind of emotional component. That's obviously not true of everything. A friend of mine a couple of weeks ago was talking about how somebody has memorized the 15 digits of pi, but I don't know if that's meaningful, but it's not what we're talking about. So I decided to go in some classes and conduct some informal surveys just to find about meaningfulness and emotion. And I simply asked students just to write out, and literally I did this, had these handwritten to maintain anonymity, because in 2024 nobody ever writes anything. So just describe some meaningful experience they'd had in class, for better or worse, and the feelings that accompanied the experience. And this ended up being very interesting in ways I couldn't have imagined. The most frequently mentioned topics were class lectures on topics of importance, group activities or class exercises, and guest lectures. Now, so the topics of importance probably were related to curriculum. So that matters. But the students rarely said, oh, gee, I really liked the class on motivation. They liked the class lecture and how it was presented. It wasn't the curriculum all by itself. So let me give a couple examples. Our discussion on homophily and its consequences, sexism, racism, etc. I was slightly surprised, both good and bad. Good because it's great to discuss discrimination, but I realized that it was a few times we actually discussed issues of race or gender. Another example. The lecture on networks was especially helpful to me in contextualizing network events on campus, in contrast to the other things I engage in as a student, such as group projects and friendships, which may be important for building both loose and close ties. And so I felt clarity and assurance. So these are both topics discussed in class that obviously relate to the students. Meaningful activities and exercise. A meaningful experience I had was the reflective best self exercise. It was so pleasant to read all the kind things everyone had to say about me. And it also felt good to write some good things about my classmates, to let them know that I've been watching them grow throughout the course of the semester. I felt happy and flattered that my peers were really seeing me for who I am. Doing an exercise within teams to see the different ways that teams function was particularly helpful. Being on many teams, this helped me look and analyze to see how my team can be more productive. On the other hand, it was helpful, but I realized that I felt anxious and somewhat frustrated by working with others. So this is giving more insight. Guest speakers. A meaningful event took place when we had the woman from Company X speak to us. Her experience at Company X and the culture that it leads made me question how my learning experience was going to be at my office. Did I take the right job? I wouldn't say it made me entirely afraid, but it definitely worried me. Having a guest speaker talk about interviewing, network, and job searching was meaningful to me because I'm currently doing that. It showed me that I'm doing things correctly and gave me tips for what I could do better. At the same time, I felt stressed because it reminded me that I need a job and need to succeed in my interviews. But it was also somewhat satisfying to know that I'm doing things correctly. So one of the things that stood out for me for some of these was that it had both positive and negative feeling components. But I think it's just worth reflecting on what's going on in our students' heads when they may not look like they're responding much at all. So what's going on with regard to the self-concept? A lot of the feelings associated with affirming experiences were positive. I felt in control. I felt satisfaction. I felt good. Most of the feelings associated with threatening experiences were negative. I didn't read all these examples. I felt anxious and frustrated about working with others, in the example I gave, or I felt it was my personality. I really didn't fit in here. That was a little bit how I felt yesterday. Do I not fit in here anymore, even if I've been here for 47 years? And what Isabelle and I have talked, it's likely the same kind of pattern was evident in the example she gave. Do students feel good about themselves? Do they feel bad about themselves? Does the article make them feel bad about themselves? So there were two overlapping types of meaningful experiences: learnings that improve practice, and learnings that provided greater insight. So I'll just talk about that a little bit. Learnings that improve practice are things like a guest speaker talking about interview tips and giving you insight on how you could present yourself to get better. This was meaningful to the student because they were going through interview processes at the time. they could apply what they learned. And the student further said, I was glad and appreciative, as it was one of the few times I could apply information learned from class directly to my work experience. And learnings that give greater insight. When we took the Myers-Briggs test, I realized that a huge proportion of people in business are extroverted. Almost the entire class was extroverted, while only a few of us were introverted. This makes sense to me because several people in class answered the professor's questions and with much vigor, and the student went on to say, as an introvert, I do not feel welcome in this class or even in this school because I am not given time to collect or share my thoughts. So somebody who can look like there's not much of anything going on, there really might be a lot going on. So why don't you just take a minute now, just reflect on your own experience. Okay, we'll turn to the discussion. So I mentioned earlier that we're talking about linking meaning, emotion, and relevance. The topics we talk about in class can be positively or negatively meaningful to them and say something about their IQ. Meaningfulness comes from a bunch of sources, including sources students see as relevant. Meaningfulness has emotional overtones, especially in terms of how affirming they are or disaffirming, how much they make students feel they need to protect themselves. So what relevance is fully associated with meaning and emotion. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but Donald Pell's 1978 talked about 3 types of usefulness of scholarly findings. One is it's instrumental. It's not instrumental in the way that was in the stereotype earlier, but they're learnings that you pick up that improve your practice. Conceptual can be learnings that provide insight, as in the example of the person who is an introvert on the Myers-Briggs test and gets a lot of insight, gets information, perhaps emotional, intellectual stimulation, but oops, what does that do to them? And symbolic, such as learnings that feel supportive. As Isabelle was giving the example, she talked about how some of the students in her class told their family stories and said, look how well we've done. So they were making efforts to say, we can make it. We can make it, even if the readings don't get it. So what we want to mention just again is a few to-dos for management educators. One is the formal curriculum is just a start. Imagine student reactions to curriculum topics, balance perspectives, acknowledge vulnerability, and embrace emotion. So I will say just, I don't know what your training in how to be a professor was, but just Jane McKenzie has noticed conventional teaching paradigms that focus just on the curriculum don't say much about how the developmental relationships that instructors might have with students. And if all we're concerned about is, I'm going to teach this formal curriculum, regardless of how important the formal curriculum topics are, if we're not paying attention to the dynamics that go on, then there are going to be problems. Now, I'll turn these other responses over to Isabelle.
All right. A second thing we suggested is that when we design the courses and, for example, picking a course material for student to read, or design a class activity, we can proactively, I think most of us are already doing that, proactively imagine student reactions to the curriculum topics and course materials. This may involve very deliberately and comprehensively consider and imagine how a particular class may respond emotionally as well as intellectually to particular course materials. And if you foresee that some material may trigger a lot of emotions, think about what is the best way to present that, so that students can read the full article versus being stopped by some intense emotions and they don't read further anymore. Honestly, I would say that for the reading that I discussed in the second vignette, before the first class, I didn't imagine students to have such strong emotions. I thought that this is I think that some students will like it or not like it, but I didn't imagine such strong emotions. So after that class, whenever I pick new readings, I always try to kind of think more about it, and especially think about the background of my student, and try to put in some, for example, reminders or some team structures to make sure that they can actually fully read the article before getting stopped by any intense response. So another thing we suggest is that we can consider balancing the perspectives we introduce in the course materials. For example, if the topic of the course material is highly controversial or sensitive, it might be good to incorporate multiple perspectives in our presentation of the research. For example, we can introduce some perspectives from that focus more about the elite and some about the masses, or some perspectives about the employees and some perspectives about the employers, so that student gets the both sides of the stories. And when delivering course materials that suggest that certain group has certain weaknesses or disadvantages, maybe it'll be beneficial to also find some research that suggests that this group has certain advantages, and so as to bundle them together, so that students can see that we're not just providing some findings that one-sidedly criticize one group, but they can see both the strengths and weaknesses. And at the end of the day, I would say that I will encourage students to acknowledge the vulnerability that we all have. We are prone to mistakes and errors, regardless of our personalities, socioeconomic class, and group affiliations. And these research findings are really done to introduce new insights for growth and learning, not to criticize anyone, not to denigrate anyone, or devalue any specific group. And so far, we've been talking about how some of the emotional reactions are unexpected. What I didn't mean to say that we shouldn't have these emotions or that these emotions are not helpful for student learning. An emotional reaction to an article, especially a strong emotional reaction to an article, means that this course material I picked really engaged students in whatever form. So when discussing course materials in class, professors who observe students who are apparently holding back might encourage them to express their feelings and then respect their feelings. For example, if I know that if I've already taught the class for a few weeks and I know how my students are like, if I gave them some readings and I see that they are not really acting as their usual self, I may suspect that something is wrong, and I may intentionally leave some space, some reflection time, some quiet time for them to think about their experience before jumping onto the next topic. So providing this room for them to feel their emotions and to reflect about these emotions. So in general, we can encourage this class to reflect on what might be giving rise to these emotions and what learnings can be derived from them.
And then we just have one very, very brief conclusion slide. What we wish for you. We wish for you meaning in your teaching. Do you get meaning out of your, well, what, no, you do by definition. What meaning do you get out of your teaching? What kind of feelings are present on the part of you and your students? And we wish you a lot of expansive and self-enhancing feelings on the part of you and the students. And with that, I will stop sharing the screen.